In this lesson, we're going to take a look at another more complex and subtle problem with our balance sheet and cash flow statement in this three-statement projection model. So moving to the bottom here to check how much our balance sheet is off by, we see that once again with our balance check, we have a variable difference right here. And once again, looking at these items and the numbers here and just quickly scanning the balance sheet, nothing here really jumps out at us at being the culprit in this case. We do have a few numbers that are close to the 213, 395, 532 that you see right here. But once again, as we did in the previous video, I would suggest that the fastest way to track down this type of problem is to look at the differences in balance sheet items from year to year. And we could spend some time pressing F2 and checking the sum formulas as well, but again, I'll save you some time in this case and just tell you that the formulas are all correct, but there is another problem and we have to track that down. It is more subtle, so let's just get right into it and start looking at the differences between these items. So I'll start with cash between 2010 and 2009, and I will just copy this formula over. Do the same for long-term assets, and then do that on the liability side as well. And then finally, we'll get this in for shareholders' equity. Even though it seems likely here that the problem has nothing to do with shareholders' equity, just because of the magnitude of the differences, it's still a good idea to have this, because in a lot of cases we could have a complex problem that spans multiple line items on here, and in that case we just want to have everything in front of us so we can easily and visually track down these differences. So looking at these numbers here, let's try to match the first year number to the first year of our differences here and see what might be going wrong. So immediately what jumps out at us is that under deferred revenue, this 213 right here perfectly matches the 213 difference down here. So that jumps out. Let's see if there's nothing else on the asset side. Going over here, looks like nothing else in the first year really matches. The 513 looks similar because it ends with 13, but really in this case our best bet is to go with the deferred revenue under long-term liabilities right here. Now just to verify that this is actually what's going on here, I'm once again going to take the cumulative sum of these differences. I'm going to anchor this with F4. We see that copying that across, the 395, 532, 656, and 762. So this matches up exactly, and this tells us that somewhere in our model, this long-term deferred revenue is not being properly taken into account. So the first thing we want to do here is check the balance sheet item itself. Because in some models, this actually flows in from the cash flow statement. Sometimes you project it by itself on the balance sheet, and sometimes it flows in from elsewhere. So I'm going to press F2 here, and it looks like in our case what we're doing, press Control bracket, we're just multiplying this percentage times the revenue each year, so we're making our own projections on the balance sheet. That means that in all likelihood, it's probably something going wrong with the cash flow statement here. So let's go down, and remember that changes in deferred revenue are going to show up under changes in operating assets and liabilities. So just looking down here, we have this deferred revenue line item, and upon initial inspection, it looks like this is actually fine, because unlike our problem with inventory in the previous video, in this case, it's clearly a non-zero item going all the way across, so it must be something else going on. The best bet in this case, once you've narrowed down where your problem might be occurring and which line items might be responsible, is to actually go in and now audit each formula by pressing F2 and see if you can track down the difference. So in this case, we have the 2009 formula, 2007, 2008 are constant numbers, but the 2009 formula is right here. I'm going to press Control left bracket. We see it's taking into account short-term and long-term deferred revenue. But now moving over, we see that 2010 and onward, we are only taking into account short-term deferred revenue. So that's what our problem is here. And this is very, very common to get mistakes like this in models, because oftentimes when you're going through and creating a cash flow statement, you forget that for things like deferred revenue, other assets, that you have to take into account both the current portion and then the long-term portion. And when you have it listed like this with just deferred revenue and you're combining them into one item, it's extremely easy to make this kind of mistake. It also happens in any items that are labeled other, so other liabilities right here. With these types of items, you're always prone to not remember to include everything, to forget some of the items that you need. So those are the most likely areas where you run into mistakes like this, where you add in one or two of the relevant items, but then you forget one or more of the other items that you actually need there. So to fix this, let's just take this formula and copy it across. So now we're using the correct formula from 2009. And now it looks like our balance sheet up here balances because it's 0 from 2010 through 2014. We do have this -0 right here in the last 3 years, but that is of no concern to us. Usually in models like this, if something's off by a tiny decimal point, you may still run into the situation where you have a negative difference. If I were to expand this out and show you 3 or 4 decimal points, you would not even see any difference there. So this does not matter. What matters is that our absolute value in each year is 0 here. So that's how you go through and find a more complex and subtle problem with your model like this. Again, the key is to plot out the differences in these balance sheet items from year to year, see what jumps out at you in the first year, confirm that that's what the problem actually is by doing a cumulative sum, as we did right here. And then once you've confirmed that's what the problem is, what you need to do is then go into each item that corresponds to it on your balance sheet and cash flow statement and see where the problem is occurring. Coming up in the next video, we're going to be getting into the most complex and the most subtle problem that we have seen to this point, and we'll see how sometimes you have to go beyond what we went into here with just looking at the variable differences, and sometimes you have to actually get into the business of tracing formulas and seeing where variables come from, where outputs go to, and so that's what we'll be getting into in the next lesson on how to balance your balance sheet.